thank you for coming again to the second of three webinars on generative AI. Myself, Dr. Nate Pritz, Elena Pascarella, we're here to just to kind of begin some conversations, to talk about this, to bring it sort of out in the open, and kind of set some, not rules, but guidelines that will help us move forward. Today, we're going to really think a little bit more about what this might look like in the classroom. But I want to start just by saying, by acknowledging the fact that this is a huge topic. I got a ton of emails, talked to a ton of colleagues after the last session, and I understand that there is a hunger for rules, for guidelines. And I think that we need those. I agree with that 100%. And again, I want to just shout out the Writing Center and the library. If any of y'all people are here, I know Karen's here, maybe Kira's here. Like some of the links directly to the resources in the Writing Center, in the library, I think they're really helpful in thinking about how to communicate about generative AI in our classes with our students. I think it's still early, right? I mean, I feel like there are a couple of different responses to generative AI that we're kind of juggling. One is basically just to ignore it and pretend it's not happening. I think another position is to ban it, to not allow it. You might have heard that there's that rule in writing that you can't start a sentence with the word because. But the truth is, you can start a sentence with the word because, but it's really hard. So English teachers just tell you that it's banned. And I think that's kind of where a lot of people are with generative AI right now. It can be used in really amazing ways, but it's easier to just ban it. Uh, I think there's another approach, and we're not there yet, an approach to a sort of all hands perspective where we all crowdsource solutions and innovations and ideas. And I think we're getting there. I see Karen just dropped something in the chat. Make sure to grab those links for your teaching, for your own edification. I think we're getting to the point where we need to we can't ignore it. We have to realize that we can't ban it, and we need to figure out sort of how to deal with it. I wanted to share something. I think it's on my screen here. Oh, here. I came across this earlier. This is do you know the company Asana? They're an organizational and management company that has software for task assigning and things like that. They do some research into generative AI, and they polled some of their companies. And this is what they think of as the stages of AI maturity in organizations. The first stage is skepticism. Stage two is activation. And what they mean by that is kind of realizing that it's here to stay and we have to wrangle it. I feel like that's kind of where we are. We're taking steps into experimentation as a university. And I think that's part of what this webinar series is hoping to do. We're not at the point of scaling, and we're certainly not one of the forefront universities in this conversation. But I feel like we're in good company in stage two, trying to figure all this out. And I share that just because, again, I know that there is a hunger for answers. And we're along with everybody else trying to come up with them at this point. So, I appreciate your forbearance. I appreciate you being along with us on this journey as we try to figure some of these things out. Let's get the official PowerPoint up and running here. When I play it from the start. So hi, here we are. We're starting. All of that was just preamble. So now we'll get on with the amble. We're going to talk a little bit about what we did last time, and we're going to explore some learning activities using generative AI today. Now, I mentioned this earlier. We had a little bit of homework last time. We don't have a ton of time to go into all of it right now, but I think in the interest of sharing our experiments and our ideas, if you tried any of this, if you messed around with any of this, and you feel like typing a couple of ideas in the chat, please go ahead and do so. I think we can all learn from each other. And I think one of the most important things we can share is that a a lot of times when I experiment with AI, it doesn't work very well. I don't always get usable output, or it takes me a really long time to get to some type of usable output. So I feel like I'm 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 a big believer in failure as a way forward. So, if you failed in a particularly spectacular or miserable or messy way, please share that in the chat. I'd love to. I'm not going to point and laugh. Trust me, I'm going to be right there with you. I'm a big time failure, and proud of it. I think the key here is to continue to try to find ways to channel our anxiety through productive experimentation. Last time I mentioned Ethan Malik, he was the one who had the phrase about 3 sleepless nights once we start to deal with AI. He also says a good rule of thumb is to always bring AI to the table. And what he means by that is anytime you're doing anything, try to see if there's a way that you can leverage AI to do it. Sometimes there won't be. Sometimes it won't be productive or effective or efficient. Sometimes it will surprise you and it will be. But again, I think that's where we start to find out how it works, both for ourselves, but for the way students and others might interact with it. Until we do that experimentation, we're not going to know. We'll just be guessing, and we don't need to guess because we can play around and find out. So I think that as a kind of skilling strategy is a good one. We are all of us in this room, reflective practitioners. We're all educators, but we are also educable. We can learn. So to me, this is a really big part of it. I think positioning ourselves in that way means that we can have these conversations, again, with our students, and with our colleagues to try to figure out ways that this could work for us. So again, those are just 5 sort of possibilities, 5 things you might try as you experiment and play around. I would just encourage you that when you are exploring, when you are learning about generative AI and what it might do for you or how you might be able to use it, to go for the goals. Find out where AI can work for you, where it can help, and be honest about where it won't. Don't try to keep banging your head against the wall. You'll build confidence through that use, even if things don't always work out the way you want. And I think it might be important to track your data. Elena and I are going to share some things today that we've tried. And I think I can speak for both of us when I say that these things didn't work the first time. But by iterating, by tracking, we got better at it. Make sure that you're digging deeper. Always take stock of any existing resources, so that you can be sure that you're aware of cutting edge developments, and recognize existing implementations for AI. We already use AI here at the University of Arizona Global Campus in a couple of different ways. If you were involved with, for example, the discourse analytics pilot, which attempted to send emails to students at exactly the right time, that was a version of using our Canvas signals analytics in an AI fashion. We're already doing some of this stuff. We're already using it to fuel some things. I think finally, I would just say you need to try to find a way to develop a habit. Find a way to continue to invite AI to the table as you work on things and see if you can find ways that it will help you in your work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elena, who's got a few things she's going to share with us.
Yeah, so the main question, like when we're thinking about this, especially as we start thinking about the curriculum that we're developing, is how can we help students build the necessary skills to use generative AI in a responsible and ethical way? Next slide. So Nate and I, as we were sort of brainstorming and talking through this and looking at this, what are some ways and what are some learning activities? So we're going to talk through a couple of different very simplistic learning activities that you could implement in your classroom that really helps to begin the conversation. This first one, we're talking specifically about research-based learning activities. So this one is about fact checking and knowledge checks. So using generative AI to help students sort of check themselves. So this particular learning activity is selecting a topic for students selecting a topic about which they feel they have a reasonable amount of knowledge, and create then a question that they could ask generative AI. So being very specific with this learning activity, asking them to use the free version of ChatGPT, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is in the oh, Nate, you moved your script. There you go. Thank you. About gathering sort of background information about the topic of their question. And this can be a great place for ChatGPT to do that. But we don't want them just to use and take what they've gotten from ChatGPT at its face value. There's an opportunity here for them to develop those information literacy skills about how to evaluate information for accuracy. So we want them to then evaluate the information that's provided by ChatGPT. Think about if there's any details that are missing, any details that are inaccurate, and how they might improve their prompt. So getting there to building those skills around prompt engineering, because so much of what you get as an output depends on what you put into ChatGPT as your prompt. So how might they improve the prompt that they came up with to get a better response? And so these are all sort of pieces that you could do in order to build sort of these information literacy skills and these skills around prompt engineering. Next slide. So this is an output that I put into GPT. Now, I was able to use GPT-4 because it allowed me to do, in the free version, so many prompts with GPT-4 that day based on that. So something that I know a lot about that some of you may not know is tutor history. I'm a big fan of tutor history. And so I just came up with a very basic question: who was Catherine Howard? And it gave me a very specific response, telling me that Catherine Howard was the 5th wife of Henry VIII. She was born around 1523. They don't actually know her actual birth date, and they don't actually know what year she was born. And she became queen consort in 1540 after Henry. So all of this information, as I'm looking about this, is correct, minus some particular interesting issues around spelling, which I think is interesting, because we have, as we see, her last name of her mother being Culpepper with only 2 P's instead of 3 P's in the pepper, which is an interesting thing. And you sort of see what's interesting there is that you, like, if you were to look at the historical records, because spelling was not standardized in this time, you may see it with 2 P's or you may see it with 3 P's depending on the historical source. So it's interesting that ChatGPT chose the sources that use the 2 P's rather than the 3 P's. But so as I was sort of like looking at this and seeing what was here, I could see the information that is there. I can see the information that is accurate, and I can take a moment to see, okay, what isn't included here? You know, they talk about her accusations of adultery, premarital affairs that eventually led to her execution for treason because it was determined to be treason. And then she was executed on the 13th of February, 1542 at the Tower of London. Those are all things that we know, and that's factual. What's missing here, I think, are some key details about sort of what was going on at court. The fact that she was only about 18 or 19 when all of this was going on. And so effectively she was 17 years old. So basically a child when she married someone who was twice her age, because Henry at this point was in his 40s. So you have sort of all of that information, I think, that students could see based on what they know, how things might be a little bit different and what information is lacking, so that they don't go to the depth that they need to go. Next slide. Another, I think, important learning activity to help students would be helping them identifying bias in the tool. So asking them to select a topic which there are varying perspectives. Create a prompt to generate an argument on the topic using the free version of ChatGPT, and then asking what areas of the argument have been overlooked. does the output include diverse perspectives, and whose perspective is not included? I think that's very important when we start talking, especially about DEI in our classes and really building towards equity and inclusion in our curriculum, is identifying how and why certain perspectives are not included. And because a large language model like ChatGPT is looking for common phrases and common things that sort of happen, there is sort of an inherent bias in the tool because it's looking for the most common denominator, which may leave out some of those other groups of individuals, other perspectives, and things like that, because it may not be necessarily what we would see as the quote unquote norm. So next slide. So this, I know this slide is probably very difficult to read, but I'll talk you through this. So what I decided to ask, this particular one in identifying bias, also having been an English major in my undergraduate, was who are the most influential American authors of the 20th century? So when they're talking about the early 20th century, we see F. Scott Fitzgerald, we see Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, John Steinbeck, and T.S. Eliot. We don't get to until the mid 20th century is when we finally have folks who are not white males included in the most influential authors. We get Ralph Ellison, we get Flannery O'Connor, who is, and we see Richard Wright. And so we see sort of these, we see the bias as it's sort of putting together this information. When we get to the late 20th century, we finally have a female author of African American descent with Toni Morrison. We have Sylvia Plath, and we have James Baldwin. And so again, but looking at the 15 authors that they gave us, there are only about a third of those roughly who are not white males of a certain within American literature. And we know, like, if you've studied American literature at all, you know that there are obviously some additional authors that have been excluded. And so by looking at this, we're able to see like what is going on in the tool that might be eliminating certain people groups or certain perspectives that would be important for us to examine. And so we may need to build a prompt that asks specifically for, to include certain groups and certain authors, because again, we have this here, and while we have some female authors and we have some authors who are African American, there's a lot of other people groups and people groups that are not included in this. Hispanic American authors, Latinx American authors, looking specifically for Asian American authors who may also have been influential in American literature, who are just not included. And I think it allows students, by doing an activity like this, exactly to personalize and add their own context, and being able to see like, what is it and how do we ask questions that get to those broader perspectives, and sort of what do we do with that? And I think this is an important piece as we're sort of identifying potential issues with using the tool and how we might approach that in our classroom, and allowing students, going back to that idea of natural consequences, allowing students to see the potential issues with the tool so they will know when to use it and how to use it in an appropriate way to get the output that they would like. Next slide. And finally, one that I sort of thinking about as we start moving from sort of the research-based, very sort of general research-based topics to writing process learning activities. And one that I particularly love to do in my own work is using it as a brainstorming tool. So say students have to write a final paper. Most of them for our classes have to write a final paper, but a final paper on a very specific set of topics, one of them. And but they want to narrow their focus. because you've given them very sort of broad topics and we need to narrow a focus to that. So it can be beneficial to collaborate with generative AI to do that. So using one of the broad topic suggestions for the paper, create a prompt to help you brainstorm some potential more focused topics for your paper. So this can help with, again, narrowing a focus and coming up with prompt engineering. Next slide. So going back to the Catherine Howard example, asking for a specific, so I'm writing a paper about Catherine Howard. What are some areas of focus that I could use for a 10-page paper? And here are 10 different examples of different things that I could explore. One, her early life and background. So looking at her family background and early education and how that might have influenced her later choices and actions. Looking specifically at her marriage to Henry VIII. What are the political implications of that marriage, and how, especially when we consider his previous marital history, sort of did she go into this unknowingly and thinking about that? Political influence and factionalism at court, what impact did that have and on her relationship with Henry and her potential downfall and what led to that? Or looking specifically at the downfall itself and the accusations against her. Like, what is the evidence that we have from a historical record that supports or challenges these accusations and her execution? And I think my one that I find most interesting is number 10 on number 8, well, number 8 and number 10, number 8 being the gender and power dynamics in England and how that affected her life. What were the societal expectations that shaped her actions and influenced her fate? But finally, historical sources and interpretation. So looking at specifically primary sources of the time that wrote about her and modern interpretations of the actions and things in her life, and how have different historians portrayed her, and what biases might affect those interpretations, and how might we overcome them as historians, thinking about, especially as we look at things from the past through our own modern context. And I think these are all areas that a student could very easily choose to explore with greater depth, and it just gives them a jumping off point and places to start as they're thinking about their topic and how they might narrow that focus to really hone in on something very specific that they're interested in. And with that, I will turn it over to Nate for some more writing process activities.
Yeah, thanks, Elena. I mean, I think one of the things that comes out from what you're talking about is that we may need to reconceptualize our assignments, and we may need to think a little bit more deeply about how we encourage students to, as people have mentioned in the chat, to put their own personal experience and expertise into an assignment, but also just simply how to add that context, how to look at different parts of the process instead of always asking for kind of an end product or an end result. Maybe the process, maybe the iterative elements of an assignment are what become more crucial for us to see how students sort of work their way through them. When we look at those activities and assignments in the classroom, we need to start by reframing them the way that a student would. Will they approach this task as something that they can just simply ask AI to do for them? Or can we help students envision ways for AI to support and deepen their learning? To do that effectively, we're going to have to provide models that encourage students to demonstrate critical thinking, but also navigate important conversations about integrity. We'll need to help students conceptualize and create prompts to feed into generative AI that touch on the important outcomes tied to our courses. We can't sidestep that. And we need to rethink how we assess output. Rather than grading an essay the way I might in my comp classes, I may need to focus on grading the critical thinking that students demonstrate through the intentional steps of the process to build the paper. This is going to look different for all of us in different disciplines, different courses. But I think as we start to experiment, we can try to guide students to a better use of AI while enlisting AI as a co-pilot of student success. Outlining is one particular thing that seems to be particularly useful to think about here. Full disclosure, I'm not a big fan of outlines. I was the guy in school who would write the paper first and then write the outline afterwards. And now I find myself in a situation where I need to convey the importance of outlines to students. In my courses, an outline might actually be the product that I want to assess. But in other classes, an outline is just a stepping stone to getting to the paper. So I'm not suggesting that you have a student generate a final product for you to grade. And if you're teaching one of my classes, an outline might be a final product. And so I don't think this is a great idea. But if an outline might just help a student conceptualize how they want to work on their paper, it's another thing. An outline can assist students with creating an overarching revision strategy, since the form itself easily allows a student to visualize the connection between the various parts of the whole. The ability to construct an outline is an important thing in and of itself, as I said, but if it's just a roadmap, we may be able to find ways to do this. I'm just going to just share the conversation I had with ChatGPT. Hang on a second. Let me get out of this here, because I pulled this up earlier. It's around here somewhere. Here we go. So I asked ChatGPT to help me develop an outline from a thesis statement, which it did very nimbly. We can take a look at this. It simply, I grabbed a sample thesis statement, and I said, okay, what would be my outline for this? And it said, okay, here you go. Here's your outline. This is probably ChatGPT version 3, so it's nowhere near as snazzy as the 4.0 that Elena was using. So it gave me an outline, right? And I can look through and broke down. I mean, I gave it a pretty good thesis statement that had 3 parts, so it broke it down very easily into 3 paragraphs. But as a student, I could now see, oh, if this is what I'm thinking as my thesis, I'm going to have to make sure that I have supporting information for this stuff. This is great. Okay. But then this again, me is here mimicking what a student might say. I said, this point C, impact of socializing on academic performance. I want to know more about that. Let's have you give me a little bit more information about what that actually means. And it starts to explain in detail what that is. It, in fact, generates a list of 8 points. And I questioned it again afterwards, saying that I wanted to focus this more on where a first-year college student might want to take things. And then it gave me some more particular ideas here. These are ideas in writing. These are sentences. Worst case scenario, a student would grab these and put them into a paper. But I'm trying to just sort of demonstrate that this can help think about ways to develop and fill out the ideas of a paper. Through this process, the fake student, me, starts to look back at the original outline and realize that the thesis statement that I was most interested in is actually not the thesis statement I started out with. I'm more interested in something else. Then I asked ChatGPT to actually give me a new thesis statement, which is a big no-no. I wouldn't use this. I should not have asked it to actually do some writing for me. But then I actually ask it to tweak the thesis over and over again. I'm happy to share this. In fact, I can drop this chat in the, it's a chat. I'll drop the chat in the chat. I think one of the things that happens here as I'm talking to this is that I'm learning more about what the AI will do for me rather than what I need to put into it. At a certain point during that conversation, it really takes over. It starts to give me information that I didn't even ask for. It leads me astray from where I wanted to be originally. We may not be comfortable with that with our students working on their assignments. We may want them to hew a little closer to their own original ideas and simply use some type of outline prompt like what I was using here as a way to create structure that they can follow for their paper. But I think we only can do that. We can only get to that if we mess around with these things ourselves. It kind of didn't occur to me when I started this out that ChatGPT would just do things I asked it to. Um, I knew it would try. I knew it would attempt to write my paper for me. It would attempt to give me a thesis statement, but I wasn't exactly sure how far it would go. And until I messed around with it, I didn't really have any information. I might have encouraged my students to use ChatGPT or Claude or whoever to try to develop an outline for one of their papers. But now that I've seen how much uh, the AI would do for them, it's something that I would only really encourage them to do with really particular strictures and guidelines. A lot of that reflection that Elena was talking about earlier, and checkpoints along the way where I would be able to see exactly how much the student has put in and how much the AI has generated. But that's in my classes. Maybe you're working with upper level students who just seem to not be able to get the hang of how to structure a paper. Using one of these engines to help develop that structure might be a good way to go about it. Um, I forgot to change this slide. I was going to talk about this thesis accelerator that I built, but it's going to take too long to go into it. And I think one of the things I learned though in messing around with these prompts, and Elena, you can support this or not. I don't know what your experience was like necessarily, but I feel like what I wanted was to develop not a conversation with ChatGPT, but I became really interested in developing full-scale assessments with AI that would program in how the AI was supposed to react. So if you tell the AI, hey, I want you to help the student develop a thesis statement, but don't write it for them. It will listen to you and we'll go through the process of developing a thesis statement for the student in concert with the student through dynamic interaction, but without actually just writing it for them. So that's a minor example of what I'm talking about. What are the ways that we can develop an assessment that will work fully on AI and still guide students through outcomes that we want them to demonstrate, but without just doing the work for them? I mean, again, this is part of the Wild West aspect of this that I find so fascinating because I just don't think we know yet. I think we're taking steps toward that, but we're not quite there.
So
So
I was gonna say, so the last thing I think we really need to talk about is what else should we consider? So these were some like great examples of ways that we could create learning activities that might allow students to use generative AI and encourage that sense of play and encourage them to not sort of be afraid of it. But there should be other things as we're thinking through this, like that we need to consider. Next slide. So first of all, I think the first one is ethical concerns. Does the tool that you're using, that you're asking students to use, utilize creative works which might be under copyright? So when we talk about things, so this is going sort of beyond the large language models, although there are some interesting things, although nothing I think behind paywalls are currently accessible by the tools in terms of the database. So it is all of that information that's sort of out there already, free for consumption on the internet when it comes to large language models. But generative AI, thinking about creating generative AI artwork, there's sort of a big class action lawsuit from a group of creators who had their artwork stored on a site that was there for people to browse and sort of order prints from and things like that. And it was used to train a generative AI tool to create AI art. And so you're taking then this copyrighted information from an artist or musicians, because there are those tools. And what are those things that we maybe don't want to ask our students to do because they're in that really ethical gray area, or should just not be used because you're using the work of somebody else to create something new? And so thinking through that as you're sort of developing these very specific activities that you do. Privacy concerns. Anything that they put in those generative AI tools can be used to train and make the tool better. And so what information are you asking students to provide to a third party as they're sort of using those tools, and whether or not that could create potential privacy concerns for protecting student information and student data. And then finally, I think the other big one is equity issues. So is the tool that you're asking students to use accessible to all students, regardless of any diverse needs? And the secondary part to that, if there is both a free and paid version, does using the free version place students at a disadvantage from using the paid version? And so when you think about equity, when it comes to that, is the output from something like a GPT 4.0 or 4.5 or whatever the paid version is on now so much better than GPT 3.5, which is the standard free version, that students who are using GPT 3.5 are at a disadvantage from students who can afford to pay for the paid version? And really thinking through sort of those issues around that, I think is really important as we look to perhaps use generative AI tools within our curriculum, and how we can accommodate those sort of equity issues or potential ethical concerns.
Which means we're kind of right back where we started. We don't really know.
Yeah.
It's this amazing new tool that just kind of popped up, and we're trying to all sort of figure it out while it's also running away from us and being misused. And I think today was just kind of a way of sort of modeling some of the experimentation that I think needs to be going on behind the scenes, whether it's for yourself, for your own work, whether it's trying to reverse engineer what students might be doing, or whether it's trying to really fully rethink what assignments, activities, and assessments in your courses might look like. I think this is the kind of innovative experimentation that needs to happen in order to get ahead of this curve. Um, I'm joking, but I often think of the first teacher who got an overhead projector on their desk, and they were just like, "Oh man, look at this thing! I'm going to set the world on fire with this overhead projector." Because it was so different, it was so new, it was such an amazing, different way to interact with a classroom full of people. And we all teach online here in the future, which I don't think any of us could have actually trained to even do because it wasn't a thing when we were being trained. So we're at another fundamental paradigm shift where an entirely new way of interacting, developing, thinking has just been dropped on us. I mean, it's like the internet, but it's talking back to us. And so I think we're in a really interesting spot where we need to pick up that challenge, really.
I see a question from Jerry in the chat. Could premium AI tools be provided to students similar to their access to Grammarly? Theoretically, I'm sure it's possible. Whether or not that would be in constraints when you're talking about budget and all of sort of those other pieces, that would go into determining whether or not you could provide those tools to students. That becomes the question. And really then thinking about what is the learning that tool can help with, and is that necessary for the content that you're teaching or to get to those learning outcomes. And I think this goes to rethinking too about how we think about learning outcomes, thinking about our disciplines and the various things that we teach. What are the things that students need to be able to know when it comes to a knowledge base that they have to be able to recall at the drop of a hat, from their own, rote memory? And what are the skills that they need to do? and be able to do? Is it important that they have that knowledge, or is it important that they know how to find that knowledge when we're thinking about what we're sort of putting into our classrooms? Is it and I think rethinking that can change sort of the focus on a lot, because a lot of papers, and this is primarily in K-12, but it does happen in higher education, where a lot of paper, where there are papers that it's just sort of a regurgitation of information, and not really thinking critically about the information that you're talking about, not really breaking it apart and analyzing, and it's a lot of summary. And so that's something that GPT and other generative AI large language models can do very easily, is summarize that information. So is that what we want students to be able to know, or do we want them to be able to break that apart? And how do we adjust our assignments to, in some ways, if it's something that they need to be able to do on their own without sort of any electronic assistance, how do we adjust our assignments to put the focus there, to generative AI proof, for lack of a better term, and make it more difficult to use a tool like generative AI in order to complete those?
And I think a somewhat cheekier answer to Jerry and then Sarah's follow-up question is that we need broader institutional support for these types of things. We just can't flip a switch. And Kira responds a little bit to Sarah's question in the chat too. I mean, I think a lot of courses are exploring ways to integrate and include this in. I think, Sarah, never edit the course shell on your own, you know that. But I think we are trying to explore different ways that we may effectively and ethically use these within different course prompts. And that's what I was talking about earlier with, I didn't actually share it. I took an assignment from English 121 and I tried to develop it as a prompt for AI. And as I said in the chat, it works most of the time. Sometimes it doesn't. And it's really hard for me to understand how I would assess the output of it still. So I feel like there is an experimentation stage. Now here's the thing though. I'm picking on you a little bit, Sarah, because I know you. But here's the thing, like, we allow our teachers great latitude in the teaching of their courses. We do a weird thing here, which is that we all have the same curriculum. All of our classes kind of look the same. So if you're teaching English 121, your class and my class have the same assignments, they have the same assessments. We understand that. That's kind of how we roll here. But within that, how I choose to approach or explain different concepts in the class varies greatly from the way, Sarah, you may do something in 225. Charles, you're teaching 225. Like, we all teach different things in our courses. And, again, we're going to need broader institutional support to follow up what I'm about to say. But I would love to see that. I would love for a teacher to email me and say, hey, I did this really cool thing in my class using AI. I don't know, take a look. What do you think? I think that'd be great. And I think that kind of level of experimentation is what's going to get us to the point where we finally develop a process that we can follow that will lift all boats. The director of my PhD thesis used to say, a rising tide lifts all boats, almost every time we met. And it was never even relevant, but he just kept saying it. And so it's in my mind now. A rising tide will lift all boats. If we're all working on this together, we will all eventually get to shore. And that's my mixed metaphor for the day.
You see, and there may be some classes where this lends itself more readily to using generative AI and playing around with it than other courses. And really, as associate faculty, working with your program chairs and having the conversations about sort of what you're seeing in your classroom, and seeing are there ways that this could help students? And as course redesigns happen and course uplifts happen, thinking about ways that maybe you could add as program chairs or course leads who are sort of leading those revisions. Are there activities that you could implement into your course that would utilize generative AI as you're sort of rethinking how you're meeting those learning outcomes? Um, while it may not necessarily happen right away because of, time constraints and things like that, there are little things that we can be doing. Or to Nate's point with the outlining, if you're teaching a course where outlining might help a student, say you have a student who has you're looking at the feedback or looking at their paper and there's an issue with organization, suggesting to a student, hey, you might try generative AI to help you create an organization for your paper by doing these steps and providing those specific steps to that student, and that can give them some real-time help with organization of their paper that maybe they don't, maybe they haven't had the chance or the time to. Well, the writing center is great for that help. Maybe they haven't had a chance to sit down with one of the writing tutors because of their own schedule and things like that, but that's something that could be very quick to help them do that. I mean, obviously sending them to the writing center is sort of your first choice, but that's, I think, another option to help them with organization or help them make sure that they're hitting all of the points that they need to be hitting, and having those open conversations with students and allowing that experimentation rather than sort of reacting with fear. As Louise just very succinctly said, as I was sort of coming to that, like, allow those conversations to happen, because this technology is only going to continue to get better and continue to grow. And so it's very incumbent, as we're preparing our students for the 21st century workplace, that they have these skills. So how can we start to really figure out where we can add it that makes the most sense, that helps the students prepare for what they need to be prepared for in their 21st century workplace?
So I think we just need to keep talking about this. I mean, we're running toward the end of our time here today, but I think one big takeaway for me today is that we need to keep sharing these ideas. People are talking in the chat about different things they've done. We've shared some things that we've done. Nobody is really an expert at this yet. We're all just experimenters and our white lab coats trying things out. And I think sharing with your colleagues, with management, with leadership, letting everybody know what you're trying, how it's working, if it's not working, it allows you to have other perspectives on it. As Kara talks about, there's the ethical aspect of things for the workplace, but also here in academia, which is our workplace. I think we need to continually have those conversations and not let ourselves get so fascinated by this tool that we forget the larger concerns, or so in the weeds that we forget to translate those concerns. So making sure that we're really putting all this out in the open, I think is another thing that we can really all try to strive to do a little bit more on our own, rather than sitting back. And hopefully, again, these sessions are a way of normalizing this conversation, getting it out in the open, and a place that we can kind of talk. I got to give big thanks to our faculty affairs hosts. We have one session left next week, next Wednesday, but in order to maybe pay it back to our friends in faculty affairs, I want to give a shout out to the new issue of the UAGC Chronicle, which just came out last week. If you haven't looked yet, there's a lot of great articles in there, but I just shared a direct link to an article that I wrote for the Chronicle that talks about this exact thing that we're talking about here today: experimentation. In the article, I just discuss a few different ways I've used AI, and then I bring in opinions and ideas and experiments that some of my faculty and colleagues are doing, and just kind of try to talk about it. If you know Dr. Lane Andrew, one of our math professors, our math program chair, actually, Dan Tiniano, who is our program chair, but also runs the weekly Teachnology sessions. we've got a lot of great ideas that I kind of tried to synthesize and put together in the article there. And I think, again, more conversations like that will help us sort of figure out how we want to position ourselves as educators, but also will help to chart the course for how we position this university to meet these challenges. So that may be it. I really appreciate everyone taking time today.